Late at night on August 15th, 2019, two police officers in England were driving in an unmarked police car along this narrow, winding road when all of a sudden, right in front of them, another car came bombing down the road towards them. And so both cars came to a screeching stop, and then one occupant from this other car got out of their vehicle, and one of the officers got out of their vehicle. What happened next was so horrific that a special law was passed to make sure it never happened again. 18th, 2019, 28-year-old Andrew Harper scrawled a little note inside of a card, then he folded the card up, he slipped it into its envelope, and he handed that envelope off to a nearby friend. And this friend, after getting this envelope and Andrew's directions for what to do with it, he left Andrew's room and began walking down the hall all the way towards the other side of the Ardington house. The Ardington house, where they were staying, is this beautiful mansion built in the 1700s that sits on about 30 acres of gardens and parklands, and it's located about an hour west of London in the English countryside. Once Andrew's friend, with this letter in hand, had walked all the way across the mansion and had found the room he was looking for, he gently knocked on the door, and then after being led inside, he made his way right over to 28-year-old Lissy Beckett, and he handed her the envelope. Lissy and Andrew had grown up in the same town of Wallingford, which is a small rural town about 10 miles away from where they were at the Ardington house. And from the time Lissy and Andrew had met each other when they were 15 years old, they had become totally inseparable. It was truly love at first sight. And now, 13 years later, they were finally getting married. And so Lissy, after getting this envelope, she saw the writing on the outside of it and knew it was from her fiancé. And so she smiled, she opens up this letter, and she reads what's inside. And it just said, "Life is slippery. Here, take my hand." While on the surface, this little note seemed like nothing more than a romantic gesture from Andrew, in reality, those 7 words contained in that card were a great representation of who Andrew really was. He was a protector. Ever since Lissy could remember, Andrew had always been so concerned with her safety. And for that matter, anybody around Andrew was just worried about and wanted to make sure everybody was taken care of. And as Andrew got older and grew to be this massive 6'5" tall man, his natural inclination to protect other people only became more pronounced. While Andrew was known for being incredibly charming and friendly and approachable, at a moment's notice, he could flip the switch and literally step in and use his big frame to protect anybody that needed protecting, no questions asked. And so it came as no shock to Lissy or really anybody who knew Andrew when Andrew, at the age of 19, became a special constable or volunteer police officer for the Thames Valley Police Department. This police department was the same one that oversaw Wallingford, where he and Lissy had grown up, and also the surrounding areas. And just a year after becoming a special constable, Andrew had done such an amazing job that he was hired on by the Thames Valley Police Department to be a regular constable, so a full-fledged police officer. And over the following years that he was a regular constable, Andrew's hard work and dedication would quickly make him one of the most well-respected and well-liked police officers on the force. In fact, just a few weeks before he sent off that letter to Lissy on the day of their wedding, Andrew had been promoted. He had been assigned to the road policing unit within the Thames Valley Police Department, and what that meant was, in addition to a host of new responsibilities on a day-to-day basis, Andrew would now become one of the police officers who would immediately respond to any emergency call that came in. He was basically a front lines police officer now. And so, of course, this meant Andrew's job just became a lot more dangerous, but for Andrew, that didn't matter at all, because to him, the most important thing was protecting people in need. And so this promotion just gave him a bigger opportunity to do that. And so Lissy, after reading this little note that Andrew had just sent her, she set it down on the table, and now with a big grin on her face, she finished getting ready, and then that afternoon, she and Andrew would walk down the aisle, and they would say, "I do," in front of their families and their closest friends, and then that evening, after the newlyweds had had their first dance as a married couple, they would tell each other that this was the happiest day of their lives. 28 days later, on August 15th, Andrew, along with his partner, who also was named Andrew, his name was Andrew Shaw, they were conducting a surveillance operation in a town called Reading. Reading is a town about 30 minutes south of Wallingford. Just after 11 p.m., the men finally decided it was time to shut down their operation and head back home. Their shift had actually ended 4 hours earlier, but being hardworking and diligent police officers, they had worked overtime because they knew it would help their unit. But now at 11 p.m., they were totally exhausted, and so as they're kind of yawning and packing up their things, Shaw, who was driving, would fire up the engine of the unmarked BMW car they were in, and then once it was on, he would pull away from the curb, and they would start heading north. At the same time, a very distressed man who lived not far from where Andrew and Shaw had just been doing surveillance, he called 999, and he told the dispatcher that just a few moments ago, this gray sedan had pulled up his driveway and stopped right outside of his property. Now, this man's property was off of a road called Admore Lane, which was this winding one-lane country road that had very little traffic, and there was not that many properties off of it. And so for anybody to pull on to this man's property would have caught his attention, let alone a car pulling onto his property in the middle of the night. And so as soon as the man had seen these headlights coming up his driveway, he had gone to the window and watched, wondering, what is this person doing? Had they turned onto the wrong property? Are they going to turn around and leave? But to his horror, once this car had stopped right outside of his house, 3 masked men who were carrying weapons of some kind got out of the vehicle. And so at that point, the man had frantically dialed 999, and as he's trying to describe the situation to the dispatcher, he suddenly tells the dispatcher, as he's looking out the window, that he thinks these men are here to steal his quad bike. His quad bike was parked right outside of his detached garage, and he saw them walking towards it. And so he tells the dispatcher, who's already told him that police are on the way, he tells the dispatcher, "I can't wait any longer. I'm going out to confront them and stop them from stealing my bike." The dispatcher yells at him not to and says, "They have weapons. Stay in your house." But this guy's not listening, and so he runs to his front door, he opens the front door up, but by the time he's looking outside, the gray car, the 3 masked men, they're all gone, and so too is his quad bike. And so he goes back in the house, he's talking to the dispatcher, and the dispatcher says, "Look, just stay at your house, the police are on the way, they will intercept that car, they'll get your quad bike back." And so seconds later, a call went out over the radio to Thames Valley Police to go and intercept this gray car on Admore Lane. So whoever was closest, go over there, but be advised, the occupants of this car are 3 masked men that are armed and dangerous. Now, Andrew and Shaw, when they heard this call, they would have known that they were not the only officers that could have taken this call. And they also would have known that they've been off the clock now for like 4.5 hours. There was no expectation that they would continue to work and go take this call. But they didn't care at all. When that call came across, the only thing they thought about was, do your job. And so Shaw, he whips the car around and he speeds towards Admore Lane, and he pulls off of the main road called the A4. He gets onto Admore Lane and he starts driving north. Now, as soon as they turned onto that road, their vehicle effectively blocked the way for anybody coming the other direction. And so at this point, they're expecting this gray car full of these masked men to be coming in their direction, and they are now blocking the way. And so Andrew and Shaw, as soon as they get on that road, they know a close quarters confrontation is almost guaranteed. But when you listen to the dash cam footage from the front of their vehicle that picked up the voices of Andrew and Shaw as they turn onto this road, there is no nerves, there's no fear, there's no hesitation. They are calm as can be. This is what they have trained for. They were ready. And so Shaw, he's making his way up this winding road. It's totally pitch black. The trees are practically on top of the road. It's like a tunnel of trees. And so they're driving along this road, and then all of a sudden, up in the distance, you can see on the dash cam footage, you see headlights bombing toward them. They're way off in the distance, and then all of a sudden, that car, these headlights, they come flooring out right in front of them, and both cars come to a screeching stop. You can hear the screeching of the brakes on the dash cam footage. And so this car in front of them comes to a full stop, and Shaw, he stops, but then he moves up just a little bit closer before fully stopping the car. And so now the two cars are only maybe 10 or 15 feet apart. At this point, it's important to understand that the vehicle that Shaw Shaw and Andrew were in was an unmarked car, and they had intentionally not put on their blue lights as they're cruising up this road because they didn't want the suspects to see the blue lights in the distance and turn around and get away. And so now they've come face to face, and so Andrew and Shaw, they're looking at this vehicle, and they can see that one, it's a gray sedan, so it matches the description of the car they're looking for, and two, behind this gray sedan is what looks like a quad bike that they are towing. And so they know this is the car they were looking for. It's on Admore Lane. This is gonna be it. And so Shaw, he flips on the blue lights, and Andrew, who's in the passenger seat, he opens the door and begins yelling at the occupants to stay where they are. But they don't listen, because now the masked men in the gray car, they know they've been caught. There's police right in front of them. And so suddenly, one of the masked men in the back seat of this car, he leaps out of the vehicle and he runs around to the back of the gray car and he unhooks the quad bike. And then the gray car, without even waiting for this third masked man to get back inside, it just begins driving forward on the left side of Shaw and Andrew, basically trying to drive around them, despite the fact there's nowhere to drive. It's a ditch on either side of the road. But obviously, these guys are desperate and willing to do anything to get away. And so this gray car has driven down into this ditch before Andrew and Shaw could do anything. And then the third masked man, who's realizing he's being left behind, he starts running around the right side of the police car. So he's trying to go around the other way. And amazingly, as soon as the third masked man made it around to the back of the police car, the gray car somehow managed to pop out of the ditch and got back onto the road, and it starts driving away from Shaw and Andrew. And as they're driving away, the third masked man is just on the road running after them. And so Andrew, seeing an opportunity to potentially grab this third masked man that was out on foot, he jumps out of the police car, he turns and starts running down the road after the suspects. And so Shaw, he doesn't have enough space on this road to turn around and drive after them. And so all he could do was put the car into reverse and then look over his shoulder and start driving in reverse after them. And so as Shaw is driving backwards down this road, he can see out of his rear window Andrew, who is chasing the third masked man, who is chasing the gray car. And so we can see all this happening out his back window. And then something totally strange that just defied logic happened. The third masked man suddenly leaps as if he's trying to jump into the moving car. And at the same time, Andrew, who's closed the distance on him, kind of lunges for the third masked man. And then just as suddenly as these two maneuvers have happened, both men just vanish, and then the gray car just drives away and disappears. And so Shaw, he's watching this happening and he has no idea what he's just witnessed. He's thinking, where did Andrew go? Where'd the third masked man go? What's happened? But he still can only drive in reverse. And so he's just driving and driving. And then finally he reaches a point in the road that's just wide enough that he's able to turn the car around. And as he's doing that, you hear over dispatch that someone is asking Shaw, what's going on? Where are you? And all Shaw is able to say is, my partner, Andrew, has gotten out of the vehicle and I lost him. I don't know where he is. And so after Shaw has turned the vehicle around, he begins driving, now facing the proper direction. And as he's driving down this creepy dark road, you don't see anything. It's eerily quiet. Andrew's nowhere to be found. The car is nowhere to be found. The third masked man, there's no one. And so Shaw is just driving down the road, hoping that as he makes one turn or the next, he's gonna see his partner just kind of running on the road somewhere, but he doesn't. But as he's driving along, what Shaw didn't realize was that there were things in the road that belonged to Andrew. They were kind of small, so he didn't see them, but the footage would later reveal that it was almost like there was this trail of Andrew's things kind of littered all over the road. There was his wallet, and there was his badge, and there was his license and other ID cards, and then there was his glove, and then there was this piece of plastic that looked like it belonged on Andrew's vest. And then a little farther down the road, because Shaw is still driving driving and scanning for his partner and scanning for anything, and there's just nothing. As he's driving along, he would, in real time, notice something of Andrew's, and it was Andrew's stab vest that he wore over his chest. And so he stops the vehicle and he gets out, and again, he's on this totally pitch black road where it's weirdly quiet, and he's walking up and he grabs the vest, he comes back into his vehicle and he puts it down inside of his car, and at this point, over the radio, people are asking Shaw, what's going on? Where are you? And you hear in Shaw's voice a bit of panic as he's like, I've found Andrew's stab vest. It was on the side of the road. And he can't make sense of that. He has no idea why it's there. And dispatch, they don't know what to make of that. And so Shaw just continued driving down this road, thinking to himself, what's happening here? Meanwhile, less than a mile away at the end of Admore Lane, where it joined up with A4, which is where Andrew and Shaw had originally come in, two other Thames Valley police cars had arrived at that intersection. They had gone there specifically to try to intercept this gray car as they fled. And so they're sitting at this intersection and they're looking up Admore Lane and they see headlights bombing towards them. It's the gray car, and the gray car comes speeding out onto A4. It makes a hard turn and it speeds away from these two police cars. And so one of these two police cars that were waiting out on the A4, one of them takes off following the gray car. But the other police car, they stay right there because unbelievably, they had just spotted Andrew. It would turn out when Shaw first put the BMW into reverse and he began going in reverse towards his partner who was chasing the third masked man who was chasing the gray car, when he was doing that and he was watching out his back window and he saw the third masked man jump and then disappear and then Andrew disappeared, that was not a figment of his imagination. That really happened. The third masked man had attempted to jump into the moving vehicle and he had been successful. As for Andrew, why he suddenly vanished, the reason for that is truly horrific. The three masked men were 18-year-old Henry Long and 17-year-olds Albert Bowers and Jesse Cole. All three of them, prior to this night, had fairly extensive criminal records, and they proudly referred to themselves as career thieves, which basically just meant they spent all day and all night stealing from people. And so that night, they had gone out with the intention of stealing that man's quad bike. It's unclear how they knew he had a quad bike, but they definitely showed up prepared because they knew they would have to get onto his property and very quickly tow that bike out of there before the homeowner could stop them. And so they had attached this long, very thick rope to the back of their gray car. It was basically like this big loop of rope, almost like a lasso. And so when they pulled up onto that man's property, they backed up to the quad bike and they looped that stretch of rope over the handlebars of this quad bike, and then all three of them piled back into the gray car and they sped off with the quad bike in tow. But when they were on Admore Lane and came face to face with Andrew and Shaw and realized those are police officers and were caught, the third masked man, aka Jesse Cole, he hopped out of the gray car, he ran around to the back, and he unhooked the loop of rope from this quad bike, ditching the quad bike by the side of the road so that it would be easier for the gray car to make their getaway. And so once it was free, the gray car kind of took off without Jesse, and so Jesse ran around the cop car, but Jesse would get back up to the side of the gray car and he would leap into the window, and as soon as he was inside and Henry, who was driving, he knew he was inside, so they're all good, Henry hit the gas. And who was standing with both feet inside of that loop of rope dangling off the back of the gray car when the gray car suddenly accelerated? Andrew Harper. Andrew was swept off of his feet as the rope grabbed onto his legs, and so his head came back and smashed into the ground, and then he was dragged for 91 seconds at an average speed of 42.5 miles per hour down Admore Lane. It was only after he had been dragged for over a mile, whipping violently side to side, smashing not only into the ground, but into trees and fence posts and shrubs, just getting destroyed on this road, that finally, when they pulled off of Admore Lane and got onto A4, that turn swung Andrew around and he smashed into a curb that dislodged him from the rope and sent him careening into traffic. At that point, one of those two police cars took off after the gray car in pursuit. But the other car, they saw Andrew as he was thrown off the back of the gray car and launched onto A4. Now, initially, they actually thought that the suspects were just hauling a dead deer behind them because it looked like a bloody deer carcass was dangling behind the car. But when they ran up to see what it was, they saw it was their colleague. It was Andrew. And so immediately they tried to save his life. But Andrew's injuries were catastrophic. He had been destroyed. And so Andrew Harper would die at 11:45 p.m. on the side of the A4, about 20 minutes after he and his partner had so selflessly agreed to go after this car despite the fact they didn't have to. The three killers were arrested about 1 hour after Andrew had died. A police helicopter had spotted their car parked amongst some buildings about 4 miles away from where Andrew was found. During their trial, the three teens would say they had no idea that Andrew was attached to that tow rope as they sped down Admore Lane. This is despite the fact that the prosecution, they went out and recreated the exact scene that played out on Admore Lane. They used the same car, they used the same tow rope, and they used a very lifelike dummy that was the same size as Andrew Harper. It was 6'5", 200 pounds, and they strapped it on the back of the car, and they drove the same mile stretch to see what it would be like to drive with Andrew attached to the back. And these experts that went through this recreation over and over and over again, they said the same thing. It was nearly impossible to drive the car because as soon as the dummy would start to shift one way or the other, it would tug and pull on this little gray car. And so handling this car would have been a nightmare, not to mention the fact that the sound of Andrew grinding against the cement and smashing into trees and posts would have been extremely loud. And so the prosecution attested that there was absolutely no way that those three teens wouldn't have known that there was a person connected to the back of their car. Also, the prosecution said that all along Admore Lane, they found blood on both sides of the road, high up into bushes and on trees, indicating that as Henry had driven along with Andrew behind him, he must have been swerving violently side to side, most likely, at least according to the prosecution, to try to dislodge the person that was stuck on the back of his car. But the three teens never changed their story. They also never once said they regretted what they did. They showed absolutely no remorse. And when the verdict was read, and these three teens were not found guilty of murder. They were found guilty of manslaughter, but everybody knew that was significantly better because the sentences were so much shorter. When that verdict came back, these three teens were punching the air and cheering and laughing, just making a complete spectacle out of it. And then after being led out of the courthouse with the devastated family of Andrew Harper basically watching them, they were smirking and smiling at the cameras and waving and just treating the whole thing like it was one big joke. Still to this day, none of them have apologized or expressed any regret or remorse about what happened. In fact, two of the killers, Jesse and Albert, they've come out publicly and said they're going to write a book about this crime, about killing Andrew Harper, and there's no indication that this book is being written because they feel bad. It's almost certainly being written because it's an opportunity to make money. Following the verdict, Andrew's wife, Lissy, who was totally devastated not only by the loss of her husband, but also by what she viewed as total injustice with regards to the fact that these three killers had not been convicted of murder, she would go on to lobby for years to pass a brand new law called Harper's Law that would give an automatic life sentence to any criminal that killed an emergency worker while they were committing a crime, meaning this law would not differentiate between whether it was manslaughter or murder. If you killed an emergency worker while committing a crime, you're going to jail for life. And this year, Harper's Law was passed. However, it will have no effect on the sentences of Andrew Harper's killers. Henry would be sentenced to 16 years in prison, and the other two, Albert and Jesse, would be sentenced to 13 years in prison each. All three of them will be eligible for parole by the time they are 28 years old, which is the same age that Andrew was when they killed him. A little after 7 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, 2007, 3 men launched a 35-foot white catamaran called the Cas-2 from a marina in northeastern Australia, kicking off what was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. The captain of the Cas-2 was 56-year-old Des Batten, and for months he'd been training for this trip. And the 2 friends that Des was bringing with him on this trip were Jim Tunstead, who was 63 years old, and Jim's brother, Peter Tunstead, who was 69 years old. All 3 of the men had spent a lot of time plotting their actual course they'd be going on, which was from this marina on the northeastern side of Australia, up and around the north side, and then down the western coast to Perth, which was their final destination and where all 3 men lived. In total, this trip was supposed to take 8 weeks, and all 3 men were absolutely giddy with excitement at the prospect of spending an entire 2 months basically just drinking beers and fishing. Now, Des, Jim, and Peter were not the types to blow off responsibility to go party. I mean, they were devoted family men. All of them had been married for 30 plus years. Des had 2 kids, Jim had 4 kids, and Peter had 5 kids. But they were all either retired or nearing retirement, and this trip was going to be kind of a way to celebrate the end of an era. And while all 3 of them had gone on other big sailing trips, this one easily was the biggest one in terms of the distance they were covering and how much prep went into it and how expensive it was. I mean, this was like 10x the scope and scale of any other sailing trip they had done. And so, on April 15th, 2007, shortly after the 3 men had launched their boat and kicked off this big trip, Peter's wife would call him just to see how it was going. And she would say, Peter was in great spirits, and she could hear the other 2 men laughing in the background, and it sounded like they were about to start fishing and maybe have a couple of beers. And so it seemed very much to Peter's wife like this trip was going as well as it could be so far. And so eventually Peter told his wife that he had to go, he told her he loved her, and then they hung up. Now, Des, who was the captain of the Cas-2, was adamant about safety being the top concern for this trip. Even though all 3 men were relatively healthy and had a lot of sailing experience, and even though Des was a member of a volunteer marine rescue group and so literally could be called on to go perform rescues at sea, despite all this experience and know-how, before they kicked off this trip, Des made Jim and Peter go through all these man overboard drills on the Cas-2 to make sure they knew how to do it if for some reason, an emergency arose out at sea. And so the men got really comfortable using all the life-saving equipment and going over all the procedures. And then also when they charted their course, Des stressed that at no point should they be sailing into open water. They needed to stay close to shore the whole time just because it was safer. And so when Jim began filming a video around 10 a.m. on the day they set sail for this trip, you can clearly see the shore in the background of this video, so they're following the course they had planned. But a couple of hours after Jim had shot that video on the day they left, a woman named Isabel Wheeler, who did not know Des, Jim, or Peter and had never seen the Cas-2 before, she was fishing in an area called Champagne Bay when she looked out into the water and she saw the Cas-2, a white 35-foot catamaran, sailing east to west across the horizon. And then at some point, as Isabel was watching this boat, which really meant nothing to her, she just happened to be watching it, she saw it make a quick 90-degree turn and began sailing out towards the open ocean away from the coastline. Now, remember, Isabel knows nothing of this boat or its occupants, and so has no idea that Des, Peter, and Jim had been so clear about at no point will we sail into the open ocean. It's too dangerous. Stay close to shore. She didn't know that. And so she just saw a ship turning and sailing out to the open water, and she thought, okay, whatever. So she didn't go and report what she saw. It was only later on when details emerged about what happened on the Cas-2 that she would later come forward and say, hey, I saw that boat and this is what they did. The next day, April 16th, 2 more people would spot the Cas-2. These were 2 men who also did not know Des, Peter, Jim. They didn't know Cas-2. They didn't know Isabel. In fact, these 2 men didn't know each other. But independently, on this day, they looked out near Champagne Bay and they saw the Cas-2 sailing east to west in the exact same spot that Isabel had seen it the day before. Now, remember, the Cas 2 was traveling from that marina on the northeast side of Australia all the way around to Perth. It was a point A to point B trip. There was no reason the Cas 2 would ever double back and be in the same place 24 hours later, but here we were 24 hours later, and 2 more people are seeing the Cas 2 in the same place that Isabel had seen it, and so that made no sense. But again, these 2 men who saw the Cas 2, they just saw it and thought nothing of it because they don't know anything about this boat. It wasn't until later that they eventually came forward with what they saw. Then, one more day after that, on April 17th, there were these fishermen that were out in their boats a little farther north of Champagne Bay, where Isabel and the 2 other men had seen the Cas 2 on consecutive days. And these fishermen, they spotted the Cas 2. And again, these fishermen do not know the Cas 2. They don't know its occupants. They're just seeing the ship. Except this time, the fishermen, when they saw the Cas 2, they thought something was wrong because they saw the Cas 2 from a distance navigating its way fairly close to shore in an area that these fishermen knew was full of coral reefs. It's a very dangerous area to be piloting any ship. In addition, the sail of the Cas 2 was totally ripped to shreds. And so the fishermen, they're looking at the ship, wondering what they're doing, but the pilot of the ship looked so in control as he's navigating his way through the coral reefs that the fishermen thought, okay, he knows what he's doing, so, leave him alone. But again, later on, they would report what they saw. It wasn't until the next day, April 18th, so 3 days after Des, Peter, and Jim had set sail, that anybody realized there was an issue with the crew of the Cas 2. Because on April 18th, a Coast Watch surveillance helicopter was flying over the Great Barrier Reef, and they looked down and they saw the Cas 2 with its badly damaged sails, piloting all around this very dangerous part of the water to be piloting. And so the crew on board the helicopter attempted to radio down to the Cas 2 to see if they were okay, but no one from the Cas 2 called back to the helicopter. And so as they're waiting for a response from the Cas 2, the helicopter crew is watching the pilot of the Cas 2 clearly, navigating the boat in between coral reefs. And it seemed like, despite the damage to the sails, he knew what he was doing. And so to the crew on the helicopter, this didn't really look like an emergency, but it seemed like something worth flagging. And so they called the Marine Police and said, hey, we have this ship here that's not responding. We think they're okay, but you might want to come take a look. And so the Marine Police, they would come out to the area where the helicopter had said they had seen the Cas 2, and when they got there, the Cas 2 was gone. At this point, the Marine Police got some information about the boat, Cas 2, and discovered who owned the boat and who was on this trip, so Des, Peter, and Jim, and the police would get in touch with all of their families, and they would all tell police that besides Peter's wife, who talked to Peter on that morning they left, no one had heard from any of the men. They had gone totally silent since that first day. And so when police heard this, they knew this had to be some kind of emergency, and so a search was launched to find the Cas 2. And 48 hours later, a rescue helicopter that was part of the search was about 80 or so miles off the northeastern coast of Australia when they looked down and they spotted the Cas 2. And it still had all torn up sails, and it was kind of spinning listlessly in the water, and from the helicopter, they couldn't see anybody on board the ship. It was totally vacant on the deck. Now, at this point, authorities really have no idea what's going on with this boat or its occupants. It was possible that maybe they had been hijacked, and so Des, Peter, and Jim could be held hostage down below, along with the people that took them hostage. Or maybe the boat just got stolen, and Des, Peter, and Jim are not on this boat, and that it's just the criminals on board, and again, they're down below, hidden from view. So authorities, they don't know, but they decided to take a risk and just send somebody down to get on that boat and just see what was going on. So a rescue officer on board the rescue helicopter named Corey Benson was lowered by a rope where he was dropped into the water, and then Corey swam by himself over to the Cas 2 and he climbed up the side of the boat and he stepped onto the deck, and right away he noticed it was kind of like eerily quiet on board the boat. There was nobody he could see, and there was no sign of any disturbance, minus the sails of the ship being all tattered. And for a second, Corey thought about maybe calling out for Des, Peter, and Jim to see if they were down below and could come up and solve this mystery. But then he also worried that if he called out, there could be some bad people on board this boat, and he didn't want to draw their attention. And so Corey was quiet and just began walking towards the front of the boat. And as he did, he began to notice signs that people must have recently been on board this boat doing normal things. Like, for example, there was a fishing rod that was cast out into the water that was anchored to a post on the side of the boat that looked like it had just been operated minutes ago. There was a blue mug of coffee that was just sitting on a table that looked like maybe someone had been drinking from it recently. There was a neatly folded t-shirt on another chair with a set of glasses on them. I mean, there was just all these kind of tells that this was a boat that was being used recently. And when Corey actually got to the front of the boat where the captain would stand, he saw the engine was actually still on. It was idling. And so Corey turned it off. Now, at this point, Corey knew his next step was going down the stairs and opening up the door that led into the cabin down below to see if Des, Peter, and Jim were down there. But he also knew when he went down there, despite there being backup up in the helicopter and more people making their way out here, Corey would be all alone if there were criminals or bad people down there. But this was his job, and so after taking a deep breath, he turned and walked down the few steps, and he got to the door that led to the cabin. He grabbed the handle and he opened it up. And the room he was walking into was kind of like a half living room, half kitchen area, and he saw there was this table, and on it was a newspaper that was dated April 15th. So the day the Kaz set sail. And then on the wall behind the newspaper was a calendar where days had been marked off all the way through April 14th. April 15th was not marked off. But also nearby on a table was a computer that was still plugged in and on and looked very much like someone had just been using it. And also there were plates of food that were out that didn't look that old that also seemed like people must have just been eating from them. And then also Corey could see past this common area into the bedroom, and very obviously the bunks inside of there had been slept in. And so basically everything seemed like it was where it should be. There was just one problem. Des, Peter, and Jim were not on this ship. There was no sign of where they were. They were just gone. And there was nobody else on board the ship. It was just completely abandoned with no sign of what happened. Des, Jim, and Peter were never found, and so we have no idea what actually happened to them, nor do we have any idea why they were seen by Isabel and the two men and the fishermen doing all these weird things like randomly piloting out towards open water, which totally went against their plan, which was stay close to shore, be safe. Or, why on that second day they were seen in the same spot near Champagne Bay, indicating they had doubled back after going towards open water. That went against their plan, which was point A to point B. Why are they doubling back around? And so unfortunately, this whole thing is just one big mystery that has yet to be solved. On the evening of January 6th, 1982, a man named Harold Bray, who was a sheriff in Jefferson County, Colorado, which is an area just west of Denver, arrived at the Denver airport. Harold was running late because his commute into the airport had been treacherous because Denver and the surrounding areas were all getting pounded by a snowstorm. After running into the terminal and getting checked in and getting through security, he made it to his gate right as they were boarding the plane. Feeling very relieved, Harold joined the queue of other people that were getting on the ramp to go down into the plane, and then just a couple of minutes later, he stepped on board and he found his seat, which was located at the front right side of the plane. He sat down in his seat, he buckled in, and then he grabbed an in-flight magazine from the back pocket of the chair in front of him, and he waited for takeoff. 15 minutes later, as the plane was rumbling down the runway at full speed, Harold looked out the window. So as the plane began to lift off the ground, he watched as the city lights of Denver slowly faded away as they got higher and higher up. But just before their plane entered into the thick cloud that was hovering over that stretch of Colorado, Harold noticed something very odd out of his window. Located just west of Jefferson County, which is where Harold worked, was a 22-mile stretch of road that cut through the Rocky Mountains. It was called the Guanella Pass, and it took motorists up and over this 11,000-foot mountain pass. Now, this was a beautiful scenic drive that Harold was very familiar with, but this road was not maintained in the wintertime. So if there was snow on the ground, you simply could not get through this pass. It was impossible. Yet, as Harold looked out of his plane window down to Jefferson County below, and he kind of scanned his way west up into the Rockies, he saw there were clearly a car's headlights on the Guanella Pass. And so Harold's thinking to himself, why in the world would anyone be on the Guanella Pass in the middle of this huge snowstorm? It didn't make any sense. But as Harold watched this vehicle, he saw what was going on. Whoever was in this vehicle was holding a flashlight out of their window, and they were shining the light straight up into the sky, flashing it on and off, signaling distress. This motorist was trapped. Harold knew the likelihood of another plane happening to fly over this area and looking down and seeing those lights and recognizing them for what they were, an emergency, were slim to none. So Harold knew if he didn't act quickly, this motorist was doomed. And so Harold quickly got up from his seat, he climbed over the person next to him, he got into the aisle, and he waved down the attendant, and then after the attendant ran over, Harold explained who he was and why his experience as a sheriff told him that this was an emergency. And so the attendant took him very seriously. They turned around, they went into the cockpit, and they told the pilots, and the pilots used their radios to call down to authorities on the ground. And then just a couple of minutes later, the fire department was dispatched to Guanella Pass. 15 minutes later, the fire chief, a man named Dave Montoya, who was driving in a four-wheel drive SUV, arrived at the start of this 22-mile stretch of Mountain Pass, and as they're driving through the whipping snow, he sees up ahead the headlights of the stranded vehicle. And so he drives right up alongside this vehicle, which was a small pickup truck that had clearly slid off the road and gotten stuck in a big snowbank. And so Dave, he parks his SUV, he hops out, and he rushes over to the driver's side window of this vehicle. And inside was a terrified-looking 30-year-old man named Alan Phillips, who was a mechanic who lived in the Denver area. Now, at the time, it was the middle of the night, it's negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit outside, the winds are whipping, the snow is coming down, and Alan only had on a light jacket and some jeans and a small blanket wrapped around him. So, had Harold not spotted his flashlight SOS signal from the plane, it's almost guaranteed that Alan would have died that night from hypothermia. And so when Alan turned and saw Dave standing there, his rescuer, Alan began crying tears of joy and thanking God that he was going to survive. When Dave asked Alan what happened, Alan, who was slightly intoxicated, told Dave that he had gone out drinking at a bar, and then when it was time to come home, he had stupidly decided to drive through the Guanella Pass back to his home, forgetting that this particular stretch of road was not maintained during the winter. When Dave asked Alan how he got this really deep bruise on his cheek, he assumed he got it from crashing off the side of the road, Alan smiled a kind of embarrassed smile and said, "No, actually, after I got stuck, I needed to urinate, and so I got out of the vehicle and I walked a few paces away from my truck and I went to the bathroom, and then when I turned to walk back, the snow was so blinding I couldn't actually see my truck, and I ran to go find it again because I didn't want to be trapped out in the snow, and I ran into the truck face first, and so my cheek hit the door of the truck." And so Dave, he just smiled and said, "Alan, you are one lucky man." Over the next few days, local newspapers in Colorado and some national newspapers ran headlines about the miracle at Guanella Pass. However, as it would turn out, that headline would not age well. 38 years later, in 2020, it was discovered that Alan had lied to Dave about why he was in Guanella Pass. The truth was, earlier in the evening that Alan would eventually get stuck, he had murdered two hitchhikers near Breckenridge, Colorado, roughly 50 miles from the Guanella Pass. Both of these murders had gone cold, but in late 2020, DNA evidence connected Alan to both cases. Several hours before Alan got rescued, he picked up 22-year-old Annette Schnee, who was hitchhiking, and after she got into his truck, it's believed he held her at gunpoint and then put zip-tie handcuffs on her wrists, and then we don't really know what happened next. But at some point that night, Annette was taken out of the vehicle and led into the woods, and she was shot in the back, and she was left face down in a stream. A couple of hours after he killed Annette, Alan picked up another hitchhiker, 29-year-old Barbara Oberholzer, and when she got into his truck, it's believed he did the same thing. He held her at gunpoint and put her in zip-tie handcuffs. However, Barbara was able to break out of her restraints. It's believed she struck Alan in the cheek, which is why he got that deep bruise on his cheek, and then she leapt out of his car and started running. But Alan got out, chased her down, and shot her in the chest, killing her, her, and then he dumped her body off the side of this cliff down into the snowbank below. So the only reason Alan got stuck in Guanella Pass is because he was attempting to flee the area where he committed these murders, and he likely just didn't understand how dangerous this pass was, and so shortly after turning onto it, his truck slid off the road and he got stuck. In February of 2021, Alan, who was 70 years old at the time and still living in the Denver area, was finally arrested for these two murders, and he is currently awaiting trial. Assuming he did it, that Alan killed these two women, we don't know what his motivations were. It's not clear, he hasn't said, and we also don't know if there are potentially other victims. On the night of May 29th, 2007, a 29-year-old man named Romy Baligula sang to himself as he and a big group of his friends wandered into a karaoke bar in the city of San Mateo in the Philippines. Life had not been easy lately for Romy, but tonight he was feeling good. He and his buddies had begun drinking alcohol about an hour earlier, and so he already had a nice buzz as he walked into this bar. He had a brand new shirt on, and for the first time in weeks, Romy actually had money in his pocket. Romy had lost his job a couple of months earlier, and since then, he had not been able to find new employment. And so this city he was living in, San Mateo, even though it was one of the wealthiest places in all of the Philippines, it was also known as a place that had lots of poverty and really no safety net for people that fall on hard times. And so if you lose your job, like Romy had, you could find yourself out on the streets really quickly looking for scrap metal to sell and dumpster diving just to find your next meal. And that's exactly what Romy had been doing for the better part of the last 2 months. He had been living out on the streets. But just a day earlier, he had discovered this stash of very valuable scrap metal, and he had sold it that day for a nice profit. And with that money, he had bought a nice big dinner, a brand new shirt, and tonight he had bought a night out. And the best kind of night out for Romy was going to a karaoke bar, because Romy loved to sing, and his friends did too, but Romy sang basically all the time. Whether he was full-time employed, making lots of money, enjoying life, or if he was in a dumpster looking for food to eat, Romy would be singing. Now, Romy was not the best singer, certainly not compared to some of his friends who were excellent singers, but he felt like the more he sang, the better he got. And he was kind of proud that he felt like he was progressing and becoming a better and better singer. And Romy's favorite songs to sing were these big ballads. He just loved to close his eyes and let the words of the story kind of take him away. It really was his escape. It was like no matter how bad his life got, he could always sing, and that would make him feel better. Once Romy and his friends went inside the karaoke bar, they made their way across the very crowded space to the far side of the bar. They found 2 unoccupied tables, they pushed them together, they all sat down, and then they ordered a round of beers. And then after the beers came, the friends all did a toast to their wonderful night out they were having, and then one by one, each of Romy's friends began getting up and making their way over to the karaoke machine and began going through all the music and deciding which songs they were going to sing that night. One of Romy's friends chose an American country song. Another one of his friends chose a pop song from the 1980s about unrequited love. But regardless of the songs that any of Romy's friends chose, when they began getting up there and singing their song, it was like the karaoke bar came alive. People in the Philippines love karaoke. It's really a part of the culture. In fact, many people in the Philippines have a karaoke machine of their own in their house. And so what that means is in karaoke bars like the one Romy was at, the crowd is both really appreciative of good singers who go up there and do karaoke really well, and everyone will get up and cheer and dance along. And then also, if there are bad karaoke singers, the crowd is just as quick to begin jeering and booing at them and getting them to stop. And Romy knew that when he went up on stage that night, he was taking a bit of a risk, because when he went up and identified the song that he was going to sing, he knew it was a questionable choice. But he was confident in his abilities. He had been singing and practicing. He really felt like he was ready to nail this really challenging song, and the crowd was going to love him for it. As Romy sat at the table watching one of his friends perform a fast-paced song about a race car, the bar's bouncer, a 43-year-old man named Robalito Ortega, came over to Romy's table with a big grin on his face. Robalito didn't recognize Romy or his friends. They were new at this bar, and so Robalito wanted to introduce himself and and get to know these people. One, because Robolito was a big karaoke enthusiast, just like everybody else was. And two, Robolito felt like it was easier to keep the peace in this bar when everybody knew him and he knew everybody. And so Romy and his friends, they chatted happily with Robolito, and then after Romy's friend, who was singing the song about the race car, wrapped up and came down off the stage, Robolito gave him a nice congratulatory pat on the back and told the friend he did a great job up there. And the friend, in turn, turned around and flagged down the bartender at the other side of the bar and kind of gestured, hey, we want another round of drinks. And the friend also made it clear that he wanted to give a drink to the bouncer as well, as like a thank you to the bouncer for giving him the compliment. And the bouncer said, thank you very much. And then before long, the beers arrived, and Romy and his friends and the bouncer, they all cheersed and toasted the night and enjoyed their drinks together. And then just a couple of minutes later, it was Romy's turn to take the stage. And so he got up and, as confidently as he could, kind of jogged up onto the stage, and he took the microphone and he looked out at the crowd. And everybody's having a great time. It seemed like the mood was really positive, and Romy really felt like, again, even though this song was a questionable song choice, that this crowd was going to love it and that he was going to do a wonderful job. But when the song began to play in the background, Romy noticed that right away, the mood in the bar completely shifted. It went from loud, happy, and talkative to almost silent as everybody in the bar turned and looked up at the person who had chosen this song. But Romy had anticipated this, and he knew as soon as he actually began singing this song that he could win them over. He was going to nail this song. And sure enough, Romy began to sing, and right away, it was like the mood began to kind of return to what it was. People in the audience could tell that Romy was doing a good job, and so about a third of the way into his song, Romy noticed that the bar was basically back to normal. He even looked over and saw the bouncer, who was still standing with his friends over at the table, had raised his beer, kind of saying, keep it up, you're doing great. And when Romy saw the bouncer really getting into it, Romy had this surge of adrenaline, and suddenly he felt so confident that he really leaned into the song. And so he began dancing on stage and really belting out each of the lines of the song. But at some point in the song, there's this moment where the singer really needs to hit a high note. And when Romy very confidently attempted to hit this high note, his voice cracked, and it was a really loud, like obvious cracking of his voice, and it kind of threw Romy off rhythm, and he couldn't really get back on rhythm. And so right away, the audience reacted by going quiet again and looking angrily up at Romy like, we knew you were going to screw this up, this was a bad choice. And Romy actually looked over and saw the bouncer, and now the bouncer had his beard down and he's glaring angrily at Romy like, what are you doing? But Romy, even though he was kind of faltering here, he did his best to kind of regain his composure, because he knew he had practiced this song so many times. He knew he could do it, and he tried so hard to get back on track, but he just couldn't do it. And it was around this point that he looked back at Robolito, the bouncer, and all he would have seen is Robolito angrily belting out the words of this song, almost like he was trying to override how badly Romy was singing it. And then at some point, as Romy is staring at Robolito, while singing this song, pulls out a gun, aims it at Romy, and fires. In the Philippines, there is one song that everybody knows you do not sing. In fact, this song is often banned in most karaoke bars, and then even when it's not banned, nobody sings it. And the reason this song is so forbidden is because since 1998, people have begun being murdered for singing it. Reasons unknown, but it just keeps on happening. Since 1998, 12 people have been murdered either while they were singing this song for karaoke or immediately after it. The forbidden song is called My Way by Frank Sinatra, and that was the song that Romy chose. Now, no one really understands why this song somehow elicits all this violence in people in karaoke bars in the Philippines, but it does. Some have said that the message of the song, which is about a man being a man and doing it his way, kind of brings out a lot of masculine energy amongst people that are listening to it, and it can apparently prompt people to just suddenly start acting violent. But that's just a theory. No one really understands why this song just keeps leading to murders. But on May 29th, 2007, when Romy sang this song, Robolito, the bouncer, who liked Romy and liked his friends and was having a nice drink with them, he just couldn't handle it when the song was getting butchered, and he hated the song to begin with. And in fact, ironically, Robolito had been hired by that karaoke bar specifically to keep the peace if the song were to come on. But as he listened to this song, something happened inside of him, and he pulled his gun and shot and killed Romy. On the evening of October 28, 2006, in a Florida city called Port Richey, a 37-year-old woman named Marisa Weber walked in the front door of her home and called out a greeting to her mom. Her mom didn't call back, but Marisa could hear her in the kitchen making dinner, and so Marisa walked over to say hello. But Marisa only got about 2 feet into the family's very cramped living room when one of their many cats came bombing into the room and nearly knocked Marisa over as it ran past her and ran up to the side of the wall and just stopped and stared at the baseboard of the wall like there was something there. Marisa was totally annoyed by this cat, and as she looked over at it, she knew what it was doing, because lately Marisa had noticed there were clearly rats in her family's home, kind of scurrying around in the ceilings and the walls. Marisa could hear them all the time, and one of their cats was now clearly hunting one of these rats. And this totally stressed Marisa out. She'd actually begun taking anti-anxiety and antidepressant medication largely because of this rat infestation, and really just the fact that Marisa hated living at her parents' home, but she didn't really have the means to go out and live in her own place, which she knew would solve the problem, and so she was just kind of stuck here. And so Marisa turned away from the cat and likely the rat behind the wall, and she made her way through the tight little living room into the kitchen, and she gave her mom a quick hug, and she saw her dad was also in the room as well, and he said hello to her. And then Marisa's mom offered her some food, but Marisa said, you know what, I'm not hungry, thank you, I'm just tired, I'm gonna go to bed. And so Marisa again gave her mom a hug, she said goodnight to her dad, and then she turned, walked up the stairs, and made her way to her bedroom. She went inside and shut the door. The next morning, Marisa's parents got up and they began making breakfast and getting ready for the day, but Marisa did not come downstairs, and so the parents assumed she must have left early for her job. Marisa was a secretary at a waste disposal company. And so the parents just had their breakfast and they too went out for their jobs. And then in the evening, when the parents were back home, Marisa did not come home at the time she normally would after work. But the parents were not actually that concerned right then, because they figured, okay, well maybe she left early and she came home from work early, and so we just kind of missed her on both ends, and that's why her door to her bedroom is shut. She's just come home early and she's in there and she wants to be left alone. After all, she's a 37-year-old woman. She probably wants her space. But later that night, when still the parents had not even heard their daughter moving around up there, the mother went upstairs and knocked on Marisa's bedroom door. But there was no answer. And so finally, Marisa's mom opened the door and the room was totally empty. Now, at this point, the parents did start to get concerned because they're thinking, okay, well, we didn't see her this morning, we haven't seen her now, we don't know where she is. But again, their daughter is 37 years old, and if she wanted to go do something out of the house by herself and not tell anyone, she was kind of entitled to do that. And so the parents ultimately decided that they would just let this go for now, and in the morning, they were sure to see her. But the next morning, the parents still had not heard from Marisa, she had not come home, and now they were officially starting to panic. In particular, the mother was worried that Marisa might have been kidnapped or something going to or coming back from work, because Marisa was only 5'3" tall and maybe 100 pounds, so she was really small. And so Marisa's mom called her other daughter, Gina, in a total panic, saying, your sister, she's missing, we don't know where she is, she might have gotten kidnapped, come over and help us figure out what's going on. And so Gina came over to the house, and when she came inside, she told her parents, let's stay calm here. Marisa, she's 37, I'm sure she's fine. Let's search the house and see if there's some note or something from Marisa explaining where she is and what she's doing. And so the family searched the whole house, starting with Marisa's room, but they couldn't find anything that gave them any clues about what happened to Marisa. But they did eventually find Marisa's purse that was still in her room, and when they opened it up, they saw her wallet was still inside. And so that sent up a huge red flag for the family. They're thinking, why would Marisa go anywhere for an extended period of time without her wallet? That made no sense. And so at this point, the family did call the police, and they reported Marisa missing. But the police got nowhere on the case, and so on November 9th, so 12 days after Marisa had said goodnight to her parents, gone up to her room, and then vanished, The family was at a total loss for what to do. But Gina, Marissa's sister, had begun to think to herself, hey, it's possible that Marissa, who was not doing well mentally, she was very unhappy, she was totally stressed out about this rat infestation, which really highlighted the fact that she was stuck at home with her parents at 37 years old. Gina's thinking that it was totally possible that Marissa had just abruptly run away, or worse, maybe she had harmed herself. And so on November 9th, Gina decided she would take one more pass through the family home and just see if she could find any little indication that would give away what was going through Marissa's mind before she vanished. And where Gina started was in Marissa's room. And so she went upstairs, down the hall, she opened up her sister's bedroom, and she walked inside, and you gotta picture this space. It was totally cluttered, almost like a hoarder's space. There were piles of clothes that were taller than a human person. This room is totally packed with stuff. But Gina, she took her time kind of walking through the room, looking everywhere, kind of sifting through all the piles of junk and clothes and everything in the room, and she couldn't find anything. But then at some point, her attention was drawn to her sister's bookshelf, and she looked over at it, and she thought she saw something odd right in the middle of the shelf. Now, Gina had a flashlight with her, and even though the light was on in the room, she still lifted up the flashlight and turned it on and shined it at this thing in the middle of the bookcase. And when she saw it, she screamed. Based on Gina's discovery, here is what happened to Marissa Weber on October 28th, 2006, the night she disappeared. That night, Marissa had come home, she saw her mom and dad in the kitchen, she was offered food, she turned it down and said, "I'm tired, I'm going to bed." She went upstairs, she went into her room, closed the door, and sat down on her bed. Then Marissa grabbed a pill bottle next to her bed, which contained morphine and codeine, which are two very powerful painkillers. They're opiates, so highly addictive. She popped a few of those, and then she rolled a marijuana joint and smoked that, and then she grabbed the TV remote and sat back on her bed, getting ready to zone out. But when she tried to turn on the TV, which was sitting on this bureau on the other side of the room, it didn't turn on. And right away, Marissa knew that the TV likely had become unplugged. This was something that happened periodically. The room was so packed with stuff that sometimes when Marissa was just navigating through her room, the stuff would bump into the bureau, and that would in turn jostle loose the plug from the TV. But the TV was actually not plugged in right behind where this bureau was. The TV was sitting on the bureau, but the plug ran down and kind of to the side of the bureau behind this huge bookcase that was pressed right up against the bureau. But this bookcase was so loaded down with books and things that Marissa had collected over the years that not only could you not really reach through the bookcase to the wall, but it was too heavy. You couldn't move the bookcase. And so the only way to access this plug from the TV was to climb on top of the bureau where the TV was and kind of reach back and grab the plug behind the bookcase and plug it back in. And so Marissa, who was likely beginning to feel the effects of all the drugs she had taken, climbed on top of this bureau and she reached back behind this 6-foot-tall bookcase and she began trying to grab the plug, but it was just out of reach. And so she leaned farther and farther and farther until she finally grabbed the plug. But when she managed to plug it back into the wall, she slipped forward and fell headfirst into this tiny space behind the bookshelf and the wall, and she got pinned upside down. Now, we don't know why Marissa didn't begin calling out for help. Perhaps she was so under the influence of these drugs that she couldn't really process the situation and didn't know what she should do. Or maybe she was embarrassed about the fact that she had somehow gotten trapped upside down behind her bookcase. But either way, she didn't call out for help right away. And unfortunately, what happens when a human body is trapped upside down long enough is all the blood rushes to the upper part of your body. It causes your eyes eventually to pop out of your head. It feels like your head's gonna explode. But the real problem is all that blood pools around your lungs and restricts your lungs and makes it really hard to breathe. And critically, if you can't take a big breath in, you can't project your voice loud enough to call out for help. And so Marissa did not call out for help during those first critical few moments she was trapped behind the bookcase. And then when she realized she absolutely couldn't move, she didn't have the lung capacity to call out for help. And so likely for 1 or maybe even 2 days, Marissa remained upside down behind this bookshelf and likely was aware of her family coming in and out of her bedroom looking for her, but she was not able to vocalize. She could not get their attention. And so eventually she died. Marissa's family would say when they were looking for Marissa in her bedroom while she was dying behind the bookcase, they said they did hear sounds, but it sounded like the rats that were running all over their house, and so they didn't know it was actually likely Marissa moving around behind the bookcase trying to get their attention because she can't use her voice. And then after Marissa died, her family did continue to go back into her room to look for her, and they began to smell something funny, which was Marissa decomposing, but the family didn't know that, and they chalked it up to the fact that the room was really messy, and again, there are rats in this house. I mean, this was not a clean space, and so they kind of thought, okay, the smell can't be anything serious. It wasn't until November 9th when Marissa's sister, Gina, was back in Marissa's bedroom and she looked over at the bookcase and she saw something strange. What she saw was her sister's foot right behind the bookcase. Gina couldn't really process it, so she got her flashlight out, she shined it on the foot, and when she scanned from the foot down, she realized it was her sister.